to the Football for Kids podcast with me, Darren Rees, and welcome to an episode which warms you to your core. A story of a man who went from a fan to a bit of a club legend, and somebody who is still playing for that club today. Of course, in this episode, we're going to be talking about the 6'7" Newcastle United defender, Dan Burn. Before we get into this episode properly, I have one shout out to do, and that shout out is for Freddie, who lives in Fleet and plays for Fleet Town Pythons and is a massive Newcastle United fan. So Freddie, a massive thank you to you for being a listener of the podcast, a huge shout out to everybody at Fleet Town Pythons, and look at that, your shout out has landed on a Newcastle United player. So I really hope that you enjoy this episode. And remember, if you'd like a shout out, then please ask an adult to get in contact via the email address, which is darren@footballforkidspodcast.com. Or you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast, or you can reply to one of the episodes on Spotify. So then, let's get into it, shall we? On Dan Burn, a 6'7" black and white defending machine. Daniel Johnson Burn was born on the 9th of May 1992 in Blyth, a coastal town in Northumberland, shaped by shipyards, hard work and a strong community spirit. From a very young age, football was everywhere in his life. It was widely reported that Newcastle United was a huge part of the Burn household from the very start. Dan grew up as a supporter, not as a superstar of the club. He was just a kid who loved Newcastle. His parents, David and Kay, are reported to have taken Dan and his brother Jack to many matches. The family was season ticket holders at St James's Park, sitting in the East End week after week, rain or shine. They were there to cheer on their team. Dan's childhood lined up with what many fans remember as the golden years under Sir Bobby Robson, a legend of the game. He watched Champions League nights, big European games and fierce local derbies with Sunderland, soaking it all up from the stands and from the TV at home. It's also reported that he went to the 2000 FA Cup semi-final at Wembley, where Newcastle were beaten 2-1 by Chelsea. Dan's own football journey began around at the age of 6 or 7. Okay, there's kids everywhere now doing the 6'7" meme. Apologies parents, I won't do it again. Despite being a towering defender later on, Dan actually started out as a goalkeeper. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because he was already so tall for his age, and he was often put into goal, a position that it's reported he played until he was around 14 years old. At that point, he was not necessarily dreaming of playing in the Premier League. He was just a Newcastle United fan with muddy boots, big dreams and a long, long road ahead. When Dan Burn was around 11 years old, something happened that almost ended his football story before it even began. So the story goes is Dan had been spotted by scouts at Newcastle United. And let's not forget the team which he supported, Newcastle United. He joined the club's development centre. For a local lad, this felt like a dream had come true. He was a Newcastle United diehard fan, training with Newcastle, wearing the badge on his kit. But then, in December 2003, around the Christmas period, a letter arrived. The letter said that he was being released from the club. There was no meeting to explain why, no long explanation in the letter, just a simple message saying he was no longer needed. For an 11-year-old boy, that hurt deeply. Dan has since reflected that at that time he believed he was on his way to the very top. He later admitted, looking back, he was probably being a bit deluded. In his own words, that was. He was not even guaranteed a starting place for his Sunday League team back then, and maybe sometimes these things happen for a reason. It's also said that the decision was not about his effort or his attitude or anything like that. Instead, coaches felt that Dan's football skills had not caught up yet with his rapidly increasing height. He was getting taller and taller, but his coordination and technique were being left behind. This is something that often happens with very tall young players. After being released, Dan Burn went back to grassroots football, back to playing locally, enjoying the game again, and trying to rebuild his confidence. But then, as a young teenager, Dan went through a frightening accident away from football. It's widely reported that when he was around 13 years old, he had an accident while he was out with his friends. He badly injured his hands, and it was serious enough that he would carry the effects of it for the rest of his life. For a young boy who'd already been knocked back in football, this could have been the moment where everything stopped, but it wasn't. Dan has never made a big deal about what happened. He rarely speaks about it publicly, and he has always preferred to look forward rather than look back. Over time, it simply became a part of who he was, not something that defined him, and there is a very important lesson in that. Between the ages of 14 and 17, Dan Burn's chances of becoming a professional footballer looked, honestly, pretty small. There were no big contracts, no scouts waiting, no big academy badge on his tracksuit. Instead, Dan moved through the grassroots football scene in Northumberland, playing wherever he could and learning the game the hard way. He played for New Hartley, a local club known for helping players develop. He also played for Blyth Town, his hometown club, where it said he had begun switching from a goalkeeper to an outfield player. Then came the Blyth Spartans, a famous non-league side, where his huge physical presence finally started to match his growing confidence with the ball. Away from football, life was very normal. Dan attended college at sixth form, studying sports science, and took a part-time job at Asda in Blyth. His job was pushing trolleys and sorting things like that out. Dan has since said that period helped shape him. It taught him how to graft, how to work hard, and how to appreciate every opportunity which presents itself. He felt it gave him an edge over academy players who had never experienced that kind of work and that kind of routine. It gave him a different type of hunger. While others were dreaming, Dan was doing, and slowly, quietly, it started to pay off. In July 2009, something finally changed. While playing for Blyth Spartans, Dan Burns was spotted by scouts from Darlington, who, at the time, were playing in League 2. At 17 years old, Dan signed a contract. This was very late by footballing standards. Where many professionals have already been in academies for years, for Dan, his door was just opening. I guess, for a second time. Darlington, however, were going through some serious financial problems at the time. It's said that the club had to operate with very, very little money, to the point where players were washing their own kits, sorting their own food, and they didn't really get any of the comforts which are linked to professional football today. Dan also had to travel a very long way. He commuted around 2 hours to get to Darlington, and he would do that journey over and over again. But his senior debut ended up coming sooner than expected. It was the 12th of December 2009, during an injury crisis. Dan came on as a substitute after 9 minutes against Torquay United. Darlington lost the match 5-0, but the score didn't matter. Dan later recalled being over the moon after years of setbacks, hard work and doubt. And it was in December, around the same time that letter arrived when he was being released by Newcastle. He was being a professional footballer. In 2011, Dan Burn's life changed again. He moved south to join Fulham. It was a big step both in football and in life. For a lad from the northeast, London felt like another world. Dan arrived for his medical at Craven Cottage, which is the home of Fulham. He was wearing a full-on suit and cufflinks. He wanted to impress. He was taking this very seriously. Staff at the club are said to have found this amusing because people just didn't really do this. But it also said something important about Dan. He took things very seriously. At first, Dan was placed with Fulham's reserve team. It quickly became clear that jumping straight to the Premier League would, take its time. Instead, it was decided that Dan would need to learn through loan spells, tough ones, competitive ones. He would have to learn the game the hard way. The game at the very top, that is. And in September 2012, Dan Burn joined Yeovil Town and was playing on loan in League 1. His debut against Preston North End became unforgettable for all of the wrong reasons and a right reason too. Late in the match, Dan scored a goal. Get in! Except it was an own goal. For many young defenders, that moment would have crushed them. But just 60 seconds later, Dan went up to the other end and scored his first senior goal. At the correct end this time. It was redemption, almost instantly. That moment summed him up. During the season, Dan became a key part of Yeovil's defence. It all led to the 2013 League One playoff final at Wembley Stadium. Dan scored in the final. We'll hear about him scoring in another final in a bit. And that was when Yeovil beat Brentford. The score was 2-1, and it earned them promotion to the Championship for the very first time. So for a player who was once released at 11, this was proof that he belonged. After Yeovil, Dan Burn joined Birmingham City. This time he was playing in the Championship, and it's said that he impressed with his reliability, his strength and his calmness under pressure. So much so that Fulham, who were now fighting relegation, recalled him in January 2014. They wanted him back. And on the 18th of January, Dan made his Premier League debut against Arsenal. Fulham lost 2-0, but for Dan, just stepping onto that pitch mattered. He was a Premier League player. After Fulham were relegated and Dan Burn was released in 2016, his career reached another crossroads. If you haven't worked it out yet, this journey was quite a journey. Once again, nothing was guaranteed, because nothing in life is really that guaranteed. Dan signed for Wigan Athletic, with Gary Caldwell as the manager. It turned out to be a turning point. Wigan were relegated to League One in Dan's first season at the club, another roller coaster of a journey. As a team, things were tough, but individually, Dan stood out. Despite the relegation, he was voted Wigan's Player of the Season. Then came a new manager who went by the name of Paul Cook. Under Cookie, Dan Burn earned a new nickname, Superman. It was not because he could fly or wore his underpants over his trousers, but because in the air he felt unbeatable. Header after header, that 6'7" frame of him would jump and he would do clearance after clearance. Opponents simply couldn't get it past him. In the 2017-18 season, Dan helped lead Wigan to the League One title, finishing on 98 points. It was the most dominant season in the club's history. That same period also included a famous FA Cup win over Manchester City. Dan Burn was absolutely soaring. And in August 2018, Dan Burn signed for Brighton and Hove Albion for a fee reported around £4 million. His arrival closely followed the appointment of the then manager Graham Potter, whose ideas would quietly reshape Dan's career. Despite his height, Potter liked to have Dan playing as a left-back, trusting his movement, passing and reading the game. For many observers, this went against traditional thinking. For Dan Burn, it seemed to unlock something new. And between 2019 and 2022, Dan Burn became a regular Premier League player. He made his league debut for Brighton on the 10th of August 2019 in a 3-0 win against Watford. Over the following seasons, he made more than 70 league appearances and scored as well. It's been said many times that Dan Burn became a key part of Brighton's system, known for keeping the ball and defending it intelligently. After years of being passed over, he had proved something really important. Dan Burn belonged at the very top, right amongst it in the Premier League. And in January 2022, the door finally opened for Dan Burn again. It was the 31st of January to be precise. He signed for the club he had loved since he was a boy. A club where he sat in the stands, eating and drinking and watching his team with pride. Dan Burn signed with Newcastle United as a senior player in the Premier League. People close to the moment have said that his dad was moved to tears. For Dan Burn, this was not just another transfer. It was a return which was always going to happen. It was always going to be a part of the journey. It was meant to be. What followed was more than form. It was belief. Dan Burn quickly became a fan favourite and Newcastle's defence began to change. It was noted that results improved, confidence grew, and the club surged forward, reaching the UEFA Champions League places in 2023. Then came the moment many supporters talk about in hushed voices. Newcastle United playing Liverpool in the EFL League Cup final, and Dan Burn scored. A beautiful whipping ball came in from Trippier, and this towering lad called Dan Burn, who once sat in the stands at Newcastle United and once went to a final at Wembley supporting his team, was now scoring for his team in a major final. It was the most memorable moment of his career. A boy who was once released, a man who never ever quit, was standing at Wembley holding silverware, and he was a big part of why they were. But the story doesn't end there, because in March 2025, at the age of 32, Dan Burn received something he had never had before: a call-up to represent his country. You see, Dan had never represented England at any youth level. No under 16s, under 21s or anything like that, which we so often hear. He was selected for the senior squad by Thomas Tuchel. Those close to the situation have described the moment as a whirlwind. Tuchel is reported to have personally FaceTimed Dan to tell him the news, even joking about his famously early bedtime. After everything, after the releases, the setbacks, the relegations, the long, hard road, at 32 years old, Dan Burn hadn't only lifted a trophy and scored in a final for his boyhood club, but he would be representing his country. It was proof that, in football, sometimes the longest journeys lead to the proudest of moments. Dan Burn's story is not about going through the academy system from the start to the finish. It's about refusing to disappear. It's about being told no at 11 and carrying on anyway. About empty pitches, cold mornings, long journeys, pushing trolleys in a wet car park, and quietly self-believing at every moment of every day. Because giving up is the only thing that truly ends a story. Dan Burn kept going and kept going and kept going. And it is as simple as that. So remember, if you know someone who loves football just as much as you do, then please tell them about the Football for Kids podcast. And whether you're playing football soon, watching it on the telly or pitch side, I hope that you enjoy the game. See you next time.